Welcome back, folks. Our next and last formal session of the day is a presentation on IJIS community efforts. Really, that's a different term for what are our committee efforts and the yeoman's job that they do while having full-time efforts during their day jobs. We have two different topics that are going to be addressed today. The first one is on person-centric data framework. The second one is on crime modernization efforts. I've made reference to those during the 2 days that we've been together, but in each of these cases, we will have what are the members of our committees provide an overview of what the concepts are, provide a status update on the work that's been done, and provide a little bit of a vision on what some of the next steps are. I remind the attendees and those that are listening that the committee work that we bring together and realize is truly a contribution of effort from both the public sector representatives and the private sector representatives. I'm not being facetious when I say that they have their day jobs and they yet still make time to participate in the committee updates and in the committee work on a monthly basis, and then they go ahead and take on additional work with some of these extraordinary efforts. These two projects in particular are examples of many, but these fit very perfectly into the reform movement for justice entire and how it may solve some of those data problems that we've heard throughout the two-day session. So I'm going to share with you the individual names and titles for all four of our participants, because it really is one topic that flows into the second, and then we'll have cross dialogue between the two and ask questions of everyone. So Jim Pingel is an account manager at Mission Critical Partners. He is a co-chair of one of our committees. Joe Mandala is the Chief Information Officer for the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. Erica Smith is the Chief for Law Enforcement Incident-Based Statistics Unit out of Bureau of Justice Statistics. And Melissa Winesburg is one of our program directors here at the IJIS Institute. For any of you that have been participants at our events, members of the IJIS family, you know that all of these individuals are very close to us. And again, we couldn't be prouder of the accomplishments that they're going to be chatting with you about today. So Jim, I'm going to pass the gauntlet to you, and I'm here if you need anything.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to start this off bringing you up to speed on a small project from our IJIS CJIS Advisory Committee. Alex, are we going to able to use the slide deck, or are we going to use visuals? Or not that we need to, but might help a little bit. So I have to apologize. I missed quite a bit of the conversation the last 2 days. Work getting in the way, of course, but I'm sure, as Maria alluded, I came into this with the assumption that a lot of the discussion that need for data to inform decisions about reform policies, about other policy initiatives, has been a common thread throughout the last 2 days. I thank IJIS again for pulling together so many excellent presentations. I'm definitely going to go back and watch those tonight. So I did catch the last session where Veronica Cunningham talked about the need, and she said it really well, about the need to bring people together to the table from across agencies in the criminal justice system and really across disciplines, not just justice, but health, mental health, and a number of other places. We're talking about here today, and really what our committee, really kind of what our work boils down to, is how do we best arm the people at that sort of table, at the table, with the best information that they have to make their decisions, to understand the impacts of policy, of justice reform, of any other policy initiative. How do they understand immediate and long-term impacts of those decisions? A lot of words on this slide. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. Joe and I are going to try and quickly make a few key points. I'm going to put some of our thoughts on the slide here to provoke your own thoughts. But the things that you've been talking about this week, the last 2 days, bail reform. Veronica mentioned innovations in how we handle technical probation or parole violations. Efforts like those going on in Houston, Denver, elsewhere, to dispatch mental health professionals, either along with or in place of law enforcement where it's appropriate. That where it's appropriate decision needs to be driven by data. And really shared data is the point we're making here, that the need to share information across disciplines, across domains, is really the infrastructure that we need to craft better policy in these areas and then understand the impacts of the policies that we put into place. Ben Bawden in the last session talked about protections around privacy, confidentiality, kind of alluded to them as barriers to information sharing, difficulty in sharing information. Those protections, of course, are in place for a very good reason, and we need to uphold them. That's certainly not what we're advocating here. What we've been doing on this committee is thinking hard about ways to work within those constraints and make sure that the information that can be shared across domains is delivered to the right decision makers. You know, we talk a lot about information being locked up in silos. Our discussion today is about how do we improve the way we've been able to share information across those silos. You can go on to the next slide, Alex. In our discussions, we've focused on, and really what we're reporting on today is, you know, trying to think through what those shortcomings are in information sharing, why we haven't, ways that we can improve the way we're sharing information and the way that we're providing information to our decision makers. One of the things this committee has identified is really kind of the obvious recognition that anything that we do in criminal justice and in trying to improve outcomes of our policies centers around the person. People who have may have multiple episodes of involvement in the criminal justice system. People who during those involvements will fulfill different roles. An offender in one case may be a victim or a witness in other cases. Recognizing that the needs to think about the individual, about the person and the impacts we're having on people span across, beyond the justice system to domains like health, mental health, and other treatment and other services. And the recognition that for a given individual, there needs to be a continuity of services provided by each one of those agencies throughout the criminal justice system. I'm going to turn this over to Joe, and Joe is going to talk a little bit more about the flow of information, the flow of people through the system that we've been talking about the last couple of days and about the efforts to reform it. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you, Alex. So this is a simplified diagram of the information flow across just the criminal justice process, sort of bookended by prevention and reintegration, which aren't really, I don't think, very commonly thought of as part of the criminal justice process, but I think more commonly becoming thought of as part of the process. And each of the main code areas has its own policy constraints, as Jim mentioned and was mentioned in the last presentation. Those policy constraints really limit what can be shared even within the criminal justice process. And we talk about siloed information. And then you can think of this overall, there are policy and governance rules related to the information the system handles as a whole. This may seem to limit what can be shared into and out of the system. And it does, but there are within those policies that we think of commonly, things like IJIS or HIPAA or FERPA or any of those, there are actually lists of allowed ways to share information. I would point out that there is a distinct lack of representation in this process for other relevant system actors. Like Jim mentioned, healthcare, substance abuse, mental health, or even education. All of those have very clear and I think well understood, or it is well understood that they have significant impacts on the criminal justice process. And the criminal justice process has significant impacts on those other system actors as well. I would also like to point out that, from a practitioner point of view, this is a big system. There's a lot of information in the system from beginning to end. If all of this information were placed into a single system, and attempts have been made to do this in the past, I don't think any of them successful, even in smaller jurisdictions, or handled in some single unified process, there would be massive data overload. No one actor or agency or organization, I don't think, would be able to easily navigate or make use of such a system. So each, I think, instead, over time, has created its own way of handling this information. And some of the information is passed on from agency or from vertical to vertical within this process. Law enforcement will pass information on to prosecution passes information on to courts, and so on and so forth. But at each level, information is either added or not passed along. So there are gaps in the information as it moves through this process. Some of these sort of groups or agencies or organizations handle the information in very different ways. For example, the courts and prosecution manage their information in a very case-centric manner. Other organizations in here may, like law enforcement, sometimes has some very person-centric systems, like missing persons, for example. But other types of systems may still be case-centric. So I'll pass it back to you, Jim, with that sort of an overview of the data flow across the criminal justice process.
Thanks, Joe. Yep. We do inevitably handle this information on a case-centric or a case-by-case view. It may be a law enforcement incident that's going to lead to a call for service that leads to a law enforcement incident that may lead to an arrest in a court case. At each step in that process, the actors in the process need to dispose of that case fairly, equitably, and efficiently, and speedy and effective justice, right? So we need to be focused on processing cases. The question is, how do we at the same time understand that we're dealing with people who have outcomes beyond the perspective of the current case or the current decision makers, as the current agency that's handling that case, that person. And how do we share the information across those case-specific systems and across cases that gives each one of those practitioners a better view of the full person, longitudinally across their entire involvement in the community. Again, within the constraints of policies like HIPAA. But as Joe mentioned, HIPAA has a very specific and very open law enforcement exemption that allows law enforcement to have health information on the people that they're treating to protect the safety of the offender, the person, as well as the community. So those constraints, how do we better work within those exemptions and uphold those policy constraints? Again, we made this point a couple of times. Reform is really about a focus on outcomes. Outcomes really center around the individual. So how do we better share information? And again, not changing the orientation of information systems around cases, but augmenting that and making sure that we're sharing the person-based information that helps each one of those decision makers better understand the full context of this person. So I'm going to turn it back over to Joe, and Joe's going to talk about some of the progress that we've made in the CJIS committee. I'll try to take a different perspective on our person-based information.
So this is a very, very busy little diagram. We've kicked this diagram around quite a bit, trying to figure out a clean way to present it. But as Jim mentioned before, really the foundation of this is just the fact that everything we do is about people. Everything in criminal justice, everything in healthcare, everything in mental health, and all these sort of domains that we're talking about, that really is the core of what we do. It's all service, and in many cases, it's public safety in one way or another. So what is the point of trying to look at information and data in a way that is centered around the person, other than just a data model? From a data science point of view, ought to reflect or model reality, and the reality being that everything we do is about people. Well, it increases our ability to make decisions about individuals and what is best for them at any given time for their involvement in the system at the point that they are within the system as a whole. And knowing information based on that person's involvement and collective person involvement in the system, not just a single individual, but all persons' involvement in the system, helps to prevent or reduce crime in the system overall. And it reduces recidivism, it redirects people, it improves outcomes for reentry or diversion. It gives us the information that we need in order to make those kinds of decisions. Is a particular program working? Is this kind of diversion effective for this kind of offender? Those kinds of decisions are difficult to make unless we know particular things about the persons that are involved. This kind of information about people and their involvement across the entire system and the spectrum of types of people that are involved in the system helps us to get to the very important question of why they're involved in the system in the first place. And that in turn helps us get to prevention. It also helps us better understand the system itself. And I think this gets to the point around reform. It helps us understand the interactions between people in the system. Ultimately, it helps us understand the relationship between public safety and equity from the perspective of a person's experience of the system. So if you think about it in terms of sort of this layered approach, understanding an individual person and their involvement in the system and their particular involvement in the system at that point in time helps us make better decisions for that person. If you pull it up a level, understanding sort of the aggregate of all persons' involvement in the system and the types of persons' involvement in the system helps us make better policy decisions about which programs and which efforts have the best outcomes. And then pull it up even further and think about the system as a whole, what its impact is, and the interactions between those types of people and the system as a whole helps us understand the system itself. So I'll kick it back to you, Jim.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So really, if we talk about the benefits and just kind of summarize Joe's point there, we talk about the need to share information. We're trying to get, as Joe really laid out there, a level deeper what that means to do a better job of sharing information. So, there's at the case level or at the individual level, a judge making a decision on whether to defer charges or whether to go ahead with a sentencing decision. A prosecutor, I should say, deciding whether to defer charges or not. Probation, parole, deciding whether to go ahead with technical violations or to handle that a different way. The information on that individual helps make that individual decision. But again, at an aggregate level, the same view of the data helps us look back in the aggregate about those impacts statistically, right? So you're looking at both the tactical and the strategic value of the data. We lay out there some of the benefits, and again, one of the hopes, I think, of starting to look at data and think explicitly about data in this way is a focus on that last bullet point there. What are the specific pieces of person information that we need to share to achieve this vision, this idea of having a better description of the person? Too often we look at a policy constraint like HIPAA and think of it in terms of all or nothing. Can't share that record, or we can't share that record because there's an exemption. We can focus on which pieces of information we need to help the next decision maker or to help the researchers fill in those gaps on person involvement across multiple episodes. So that idea of finer grain control over what we're sharing with whom. Let's go to the next slide and transition into a specific example, just briefly. And hopefully from our conversation so far, this has been fairly evident where we're going with this too. But the idea of augmenting or of, in some cases possibly replacing law enforcement response to an incident with mental health response. This isn't necessarily anything new. We've had crisis intervention teams in large cities for a long time. Those people, whether it's the dispatcher who, if they have an idea of who that individual is, making some quick decisions about what involvement that person's had, whether it's the people in the crisis intervention team, whether that's law enforcement or treatment providers. Again, understanding, is this somebody who's cycling through the system? Is this someone who with a history of treatment? A better idea at that point of contact of longitudinally who that person is, and throughout the community, what types of involvement they've had. Joe, I think you were going to take a quick, you're going to talk to the second two bullet slides there about specifically the types of information we're trying to arm people with in this example.
Sure. So in terms of things like dispatch and the law enforcement need, I know in this particular instance, I mean, this is pointed at that example that Jim brought up earlier with Houston and some of the work that they're doing. And we've had a lot of discussions with Diana Poor on this. Diana's great, by the way, if you haven't met her. If dispatch knows who they're dealing with, say in any given call, they can often provide more valuable information to the responders themselves. And that leads to better resources being on scene more quickly. That's sort of a broad way to look at it. Information such as indicators of past or present treatment for certain conditions. A more specific example might be difficulty communicating. For example, law enforcement doesn't necessarily know when they get a call for service unless somebody like dispatch tells them that when they show up, this person that they're going to be dealing with can't communicate well. And so how they deal with that, if the person is acting out, if there's a difficulty in dealing with that person, they may not know that what the cause or the origin of that difficulty is. And without any other information to the contrary, the outcomes for that call aren't necessarily going to be what you want them to be. However, if dispatch has access to information that says, hey, this is John Smith, and he's had a history of treatment for, some condition, they can arm law enforcement with that. Law enforcement at least can deal with the information or the situation differently with that knowledge. More to the point, dispatch may also send a mental health professional to the scene. They may instead, like Jim said, send crisis intervention folks instead of just law enforcement. It gives them more tools. It gives them the ability to deal with the situation perhaps in a more appropriate manner if they have access to those systems. If they have access to those systems, but they have no way to search them or access them in a manner that allows them to be certain that they're dealing with this particular individual. If they're not person-centric, say they're case-centric, and they don't know what particular case number they may be looking for, it's just a person, and the guy's name is John Smith, that's not really going to help them much. So the way that a person-centric data model may help here is having some sort of particular identifier, having a history of involvement, having other kinds of pointers or indicators between the two information sharing systems will assist dispatch in identifying this particular individual. From a higher perspective, policymakers and decision makers also need to see that information. Combining information across systems and domains like law enforcement and mental health. We keep going back to that because we talked about it quite a bit in the working group, to be able to make informed decisions about policy and the application of limited resources. So think about from the perspective of, say, a legislator or a city commissioner, where are the best outcomes? Where best to invest limited public dollars? And they're thinking about these questions, and I guarantee you that there's not enough money to go around, and public safety gets pretty limited dollars in the big, budget questions that get asked. So when we're getting asked those questions by policymakers, we need to be able to arm them with information that shows what those outcomes are. And it's really difficult to do that if we don't have aggregate information about persons whom we're serving. So moving from that, and Alex, I think you can pop to the next slide. Thank you. We spent quite a bit of time developing potential use cases. And here's a list of them. I'm not going to go through them all, but I do want to sort of mention a couple of them. For example, we've discussed in detail, again, the need in many instances of a mental health skill set in calls for service at the local level. As you know, Jim and I have talked about, when a call for service comes in, if dispatch has some information at hand about how best to dispatch those services, whether it be to bring in mental health professionals or officers with specific training, then having a person-centric data model can facilitate that ability. It can also, on the back end, very clearly assist with showing those outcomes, determining which models work best over time, and provide an ability to make solid policy decisions. Another one of the use cases that we have discussed in a little more detail is the human trafficking use case. So this one is actually fairly complicated, and I don't think we have time to really delve into it here, but at a high level, human trafficking efforts often suffer from a lack of knowledge about a victim's involvement in the system as a whole. And making decisions about whether someone is a victim or a suspect, how to treat them in a particular incident, whether to add another criminal entry to a record or refer them to victim services, that can be a complex and difficult decision. Having more and accurate information at hand is much easier if the relevant systems are person-centric with clear and accurate identifiers, and law enforcement will much more easily be able to determine, for example, if someone's a repeat runaway, which is a primary risk factor, or it has been involved in the drug trade as a low-level drug mule, or there are any number of risk factors. If they have access to health services or juvenile justice systems that are also person-centric, which record that kind of information. And currently that is not generally the case. It is in some places, but it is generally not the case that the people making the decision at the time whether to treat this person as a victim or a suspect or refer them to victim services don't generally have immediate access to that kind of information. Not because they don't have access to the databases, but because they're not person-centric and they don't know what case to look for, and it's not easily accessible because a lot of folks don't think about the data in that way. It's their, Jane Doe and its case number, and then from case number it goes through the system, and then they're done with it and the case is closed, and then the next time Jane Doe comes up, it's just a new case. So I think at this point, that's the use cases. I don't want to spend a whole lot more time on those. So Jim, if you.
All right, Joe. So as we discuss this, either you're thinking this is blatantly obvious that we're stating, or it's pie in the sky changes that we'll never see. We've been trying to walk a line between those two things with this initiative. One of the things that we hope to do as we go forward, a couple of things to make sure we're walking that line and communicating things that are going to be valuable to you all, the practitioners, information system designers, users of this data. Build out that conceptual model. As Joe said, we've gone back and forth on how exactly to model the information, what level of complexity. I mentioned the ability to identify and maybe tag some metadata on some of those data elements, where the policy constraints exist and what those constraints allow and don't allow. I want to call your attention to that last bullet point there. We're not necessarily advocating putting on the brakes and redesigning every case-based information, every court case management system, every records management system. What I think this model is going to help us do, one of the things immediately is when we talk about information sharing across domains, across systems, we're either talking about building sets of data for aggregate use for research, or we're talking transactionally about reflecting the information that flows in the workflow from one decision maker, one agency to another. I think the hope is by publishing and starting some communication and discussion around this person-centric way of modeling the information gives us a new perspective, a perspective that's focused on the person and focused on assessing those impacts when we talk about what information to share. When we run into these roadblocks of what information we cannot share, let's try to focus on the person, on the need for person-based information that needs to flow from one system to another. Hopefully, with this model as the background for those sorts of decisions and designing those sorts of information sharing solutions, we can move this down the road and again, help to provide a shared set of data that's better infrastructure for assessing the reforms. And I can tell it's time to get moving because Alex is advancing the slides ahead of time. I'm going to turn it back over to Joe for some final thoughts and a really nice clean segue to Erica's presentation. Thanks everybody for your time. Thanks again, IJIS Institute.
So I will do my best to make a clean segue. Thank you, Jim. So what is the long-term vision? I think that what we're trying to accomplish here, seeing that the information is relevant at the time a decision is made, is critical to making a good decision. So that's really a big part of this. I think analysis of data related to processes that are centered on people should also rely on systems that have information that is centered on people to provide meaningful analysis. That seems a little circular and maybe seems a little obvious after this presentation, but I think in most instances, systems are built to serve their purpose, and that is all. And I think what we need to do is sort of think about better linking of person data to provide those more insightful analytics as an outcome of the systems. And then sort of shift our focus. Shifting to a person-centric data model helps us to shift to focusing on an individual's outcomes, on persons in plural outcomes, and subsequently measuring the system's outcomes overall, being able to measure the success of the system by any number of metrics, including metrics like equity. So with that, I think we can segue and move to the next section.
Thanks, Joe and Jim. Really appreciate your comments. So it's clear that the theme over the last 2 days, as all of our presenters have talked, is the fact that in order for reform to occur, we really need to look at the issues related to data improvement and collection of data. And I think Jim and Joe, you really hit a key piece of this that's missing in this puzzle, which is consistently collecting that data across the system. And while different parts of the system have different responsibilities, we do need to work to make sure that we're using common definitions and collecting data in common ways. You know, person data is collected from a person perspective in some aspects of the system. Other aspects of the system focus on cases. But I think there's another piece that's missing as well, and related to reform, and that is the fact that we really need to have a clear picture of all of the crime that's occurring in our communities. We certainly have pictures of crime, but the fact is, as you think about crime and what occurs, it's a fact that we don't know the full scope and totality of crime which occurs in the United States. This is a basic problem that's plagued us as a nation for a long time. Think about it, NIBRS is really just getting started and off the ground. It's taken us 20 years to get there. We've spent close to 100 years collecting UCR data that was pretty limited. So we certainly have some, you know, a very limited scope of what's happening. with crime. I think Joe started talking about human trafficking in his presentation, and I know that was a focus in some of the presentations yesterday as well. There were just under 1,900 incidents of human trafficking reported to the FBI's UCR program in 2019. We all know that number is way too low. And certainly there are a lot of factors that contribute to that. But what we really need to start to do in order to move reform forward is unravel all those factors and figure out a better way to report crime and think of a new path forward so that we get better data and have a better picture of what's occurring in the nation. And it isn't just that dark figure of crime, if you will. We really have to step back and look at basic measures of unreported crime for certain types of offenses and subsets of victims. Currently, our measures exclude some of the non-traditional types of crimes, even like cybercrime, certain large-scale and high-impact fraud schemes, environmental crimes, domestic terrorism. There are so many categories. I could just go on and on regarding those categories that we're not collecting data on. So we really have to think about how do we get to a system that gives us an aggregate measure of crime occurring in the nation. Right now, we don't have a single aggregate measure of what really constitutes the totality of crime. There's no way to quantify the impacts and costs to victims, perpetrators, and more broadly to our society as a whole with the current programs in place. There are so many layers that we have to look at related to this. You know, local agencies collect data, that data gets summarized and pushed up to the state level. And then from there, it's summarized even more and pushed to the federal level. So by the time it really gets to the top, to those systems where the data is published, it may not be reflecting the accurate picture that we would expect it to reflect. And it's collected in a piecemeal fashion. There are so many agencies involved in this process. And even if you look at it at state levels, there are different state organizations involved in collecting different types of crime categories. Even at the national level, there are different organizations. The FBI collects UCR data, BJS collects victimization data. We need a central location in a central way and a more cohesive way to bring this data together and move us forward. You know, as many of the speakers have said the past couple of days, we don't have a true picture of the criminal justice system. Without the data, we need to analyze patterns, look at prosecution decisions, sentencing decisions, and community release without having this comprehensive picture. And I'm going to turn it over to Erica because she participated in a National Academy of Sciences Foundation group that really took a look at this topic of reporting crime in the United States and what we might do moving forward to do a better job at reporting crime and to be more comprehensive.
Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate it. And I was on the other side of the table with some of the reform work that has been done, in the sense that I wasn't a panel member for the larger National Academies organization, but I had the honor of being questioned by them a number of different times on the work that we're doing at BJS. So I feel like then having this perspective of seeing the recommendations and understanding what some of the limitations are within my own federal statistical agency has, if I can say this without sounding a little sort of out there, I think it's given me an opportunity to see how those two things can meet up and where we have sort of lacked some creativity moving forward. So to that end, we want to talk a bit about, like, how is it that we can move forward, focusing on crime data modernization efforts that support these reform efforts. And again, I know Domingo in one of the previous sessions had made mention of, you know, the term justice reform being better than criminal justice reform. And I wholeheartedly agree. And a little bit of what you're going to hear in this discussion is less strangely enough, less about the specific person, although there is a micro level component to this in terms of improvements that we could gain, I believe, through instituting a new paradigm, honestly, for how we imagine the crime problem. But we're also talking a lot about what are the gains that we can see at the macro level. How is it that we can better understand some of these concepts of public safety and community wellness and measure differential impact on certain segments of the population, rather than focusing just on the person, like having both measures to really truly understand what kind of impact we can have through changes to these data systems. So, you know, in terms of like why this matters, it really has to do with, you know, having data in these silos, not being able to make a lot of times apples to apples comparisons. You know, so much work is done on the front end in these information systems to force a bunch of different definitions into one. And it leaves us with a situation where we have this one-to-many sort of translation of data, and it muddies the waters and does make comparability a little bit more difficult, and also makes merging of the information more difficult. And in part, that's because we've really lacked this organizing theme or a way to sort of unify these data collections. And I think that's a lot of what I've been hearing in the panels that I've been able to attend the last couple of days, is that we really want to coalesce around a reason why we're doing this. I mean, we've all known for years why that is, but to really articulate it in a way that can drive forward these policy changes and shifts in how we focus on our data collection and integrate that into the everyday work, instead of you know, having it be a bolt-on of, you know, this is the real work I do, and then I'm going to collect some data on the side. So in terms of this path forward, again, Melissa had made mention to this, there was a National Academy of Sciences panel on modernizing crime statistics. And their real goal, I mean, it was fairly multifaceted, but I would say one of the overarching goals that they identified for crime data collection is to ensure this comparability across areas and over time. So to really say, you know, we want to start with a structure for how we gather criminal justice data, really criminal justice focused, but I do want to bring it sort of back to the more holistic picture. Criminal justice focused, and to say, let's start from there, not from the individual definitions that organizations might typically tend to use, and then figure out how to make these systems work underneath that kind of a paradigm. And we've included here a little bit of a nod to the Crime Indicators Working Group. I might have to stop talking about them at some point soon, because that group last met like a number of years ago, like 5-ish years ago. So, but I do feel like that work is still very relevant. We brought together a number of different law enforcement leaders to have a discussion about what are the indicators of crime that are really critical to them as law enforcement leaders, chiefs and sheriffs. You know, it's not just a matter of how many arrests you made, how many traffic stops you made. There's a lot more that they identified to really contextualize the information, contextualize what crime is in their community, and to be able to have a much more clear discussion of what are the challenges that they face in enforcing laws in their jurisdiction. And some of the challenges with making this shift to you know, these models that are much more I would say modern, but just more flexible and able to pivot to deal with I would say more prescient types of issues that are facing us at the time. You know, some of these challenges have to do with the development of our crime data collection over time. Not that there was anything wrong with it or is currently anything wrong with it, but just a matter of, you know, it's really hard once you've gotten used to something for so long, it's very difficult to break out of that mold. And not only is it difficult because of the structure, but it's also difficult because we establish our processes around that particular way of examining the information. We allow certain organizations, you know, at the state and the federal level to be the owners of that information. So that brings with it a whole other set of governance issues when you're talking about making any sorts of real inroads to change in that structure. And then you layer on top of that the cost, and it's never going to be free. And and so the struggle is, again, this alludes to some themes that have been, that have come out in other panelists' discussion, that, we really do face a challenge in how to fund some of these efforts. And when it comes to changing the way you collect crime data, as much as or data, justice related data generally, as much as we all want to do that, and as much as we recognize that data is the evidence that we need to make better decisions, at the end of the day, it's hard to justify paying for a data change versus paying for another body to go do the work. And that's really part of the issue that we face now. We face it as a federal statistical agency at BJS, but that challenge is so much greater once you start moving, sort of down the levels of government, below the federal level. So we want to take a step back, I guess I would say, and assess our current infrastructure at a bit of a higher level. Part of what the NAS panel recommended was a set of principles that would sort of guide these modernization efforts. And we don't have to go through all of these, but it's just to say that these are principles that would level set the way that we collect information, and that we understand that it's okay, as Joe was saying, it's okay for a lot of different agencies to collect the components of information that we need to have a more holistic picture, as long as we can figure out that data sharing and that data sharing link that's going to appropriately let us understand the bigger picture. And the big takeaway from the principles when it comes to something like crime data collection from on the administrative record side of things, I'm specifically thinking about data from law enforcement agencies, is that we need to focus on the attributes of those crimes. And an attribute is not what falls out of the penal code definition. The attribute is where you're talking specifically about what happened in the incident. And the penal code citation is an attribute of that incident. You had someone who was, well, it's hard for me to do without actually using the word, the offense word, right? But like someone is robbed, but I don't need that statute citation to say they were injured, they were, there was a gun pointed at them during that incident. These are the characteristics of the victim. These are the characteristics of the offender. And then I can have that penal code citation that tells me in that state in which it occurred, this is the offense that would be charged. And that's a separate issue and doesn't drive the offense classification, but is an outgrowth of the incident attributes. And that's really where we want to be able to move as we modernize and try to find ways to say, a data collection on incidents known to law enforcement captures this subset of information, and then all these other agencies capture other subsets of the required information. So with that in mind, and I know we're kind of low on time here, so I'm gonna try to hurry up. The NAS recommended a series of levels to their crime classification. The first level has 11 main categories, and then depending on, it's kind of like a pick list or a like a TurboTax kind of model, if you will. Depending on the first level category you choose, it cascades down into a number of different second level categorical choices, questions, attributes of that particular incident that you would need to fill out in order to understand that first level category more. And then some of those step out into a third level and some of those step out into a fourth level. So while these numbers get relatively large as you go down the levels, it's not as if every incident is required to fill out 131 third level characteristics. So, it sort of controls the flow of information a little bit better, which was one of the challenges that they tackled in the classification in the first place. So these are the 11 first level categories, and the boxes around these 5 in particular here are to note that those are the 5 that the typical sort of person crimes captured right now in NIBR's and UCR summary that's where they reside. And this is to illustrate that there are 6 other categories within this first level set of classifications that the NAS panel identified that would be important to understand to really talk much more holistically about crime in a community. And the reason that these are identified as important, and that honing in on the fact that 6 of the 11 here, we measure some of them okay. So like grain of salt, I didn't quite know exactly everything in this slide, but that is currently captured in some of our systems. But we need to have a more holistic way to talk about what is really happening at the macro level. And we've had tons of case studies, lots of research over decades within the criminal justice discipline, public health, sociology, I guess is what I want to say, looking specifically at, what are these macro level influences on individual behavior, outcomes for individuals at various stages of their involvement with the justice system. But we don't have a holistic way right now to say, what is the totality of crime and the influences that are brought to bear on a community that we can use as a measure of wellness overall for that community and potential risk of harm for the members, for the community members who live there. And so where does this take us, I guess? So from the perspective of the work that we do at BJS and the federal statistical community, we know that we need to look at data on crimes experienced by the public. So this is getting back to that, sort of being able to measure not just reported crime, but that dark figure of crime that Melissa mentioned, things that don't get reported to law enforcement or some other reporting authority. For many, many years, our National Crime Victimization Survey has provided a national measure of reported and unreported crime. But we have, due to expense and sort of the, I would say some of the attributes of a survey-based model of gathering this data, it's been much more difficult to generate those estimates at lower levels of geography, where they're really going to be much more useful to practitioners and policymakers. So we've been focusing a number of efforts in that arena. In terms of data on crimes known to law enforcement, so a lot of you guys know, and we had a panel at another conference earlier this week too, talking specifically about the NIBRS transition, the work that we've been doing with the FBI and the National Crime Statistics Exchange, and looking to estimate key indicators of crime known to law enforcement, trying to bring some of those ancillary measures of community wellness and safety into the mix when we're looking at the ways that we want to analyze the data on the back end. And then the third sort of bucket here that I want to mention is that we really need to then to move, I would say, in the next year or two into a focus on how can we understand policy differences across time and place when it comes to connecting law enforcement data with what actually happens further down the line within the courts, whether charges are brought, what happens to that defendant, and how do we make those linkages to really understand victimization and offending and that key overlap there that we've struggled for years to really measure on a broader scale. And so immediately what is next? And Melissa, I think you probably want to mention a few things here too, but really we want to try at least to implement a proof of concept for this attribute-based crime incident data model. To move away from the penal code as the driver for the classification of an incident, and then to evaluate the impact of that change. How does this help us really understand more about what is happening within the criminal justice environment, specifically within a local community, but then also to see, does this provide a platform in a shift in how we're viewing the data that lets us connect information from other systems so we can start to try to build out a much more holistic understanding around the law enforcement component of intervention within a particular place. And we hope that the work that we've been doing on the NIBRS transition is really going to be brought to bear. And actually not just ours, it is our collective knowledge You know, so much of what has helped us understand the needs on the NIBR side of things is the work that industry has done and the information that they've been able to provide us over all these years in supporting agencies and what some of those impediments are. Melissa, did you want to add anything to this slide?
Melissa, you're on mute. The first time I had to say that during this conference.
That's funny.
Thank you. And of course it would be me, right, Maria? So I would just close our presentation by saying that I think that with both the topic of crime modernization, person-centric, and all the other issues that we've talked about over the past couple of days, it's very clear that we need to continue to encourage partnerships between industry and practitioners. And we really need to think about how we can work together to really incubate some of these ideas, if you will, and pilot them to figure out what's going to work best so that we can move our nation forward from the perspective of having the perfect view of data and crime within the nation. And Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, panelists. I'm just going to check the chat box. I do see that Jim sent out kudos to the entire committee. That goes for all of our supporters of these efforts. As we mentioned before, the committees do this on their own time, do this for their own dedication. So Jim, I'm with you in thanking them, but let me reiterate my thanks for all 4 of you participating on this panel. Crime modernization effort and the person-centric effort are efforts that, as you well know, we've been focusing on now for several months, but for the audience purposes, are some of those data-focused issues that I just can go ahead and move on with everyone's engagement in order to chip away at what needs to be done for supporting justice reform. It's not the end-all be-all, but any comprehensive solution or support of justice reform is going to take various forms and fashions and will need to be a holistic picture. To that end, we're very grateful to the panelists and for all the work that this effort and these efforts represented, because it is something that will become priorities for IJIS. With that in mind, I'm going to sort of sum up some of the messages that we had from our 2-day events. As we saw with what was the collection of individuals, organizations, practice organizations and associations, we confirmed what had been, of course, our thought that justice reform entire is not only different challenges for different individuals, different makeup for different organizations, but even the priorities of what to address were going to be disparate. What I thought fascinating is that despite the different views, there was so much commonality and so many common denominators in how we could address it. To that end, we do plan on moving forward on what are several different efforts that IJIS is looking forward to organizing, is looking forward to participating in, and will always look to its partners at the federal, state, local levels, private sector, public sector, practice organizations, academia, research organizations, et cetera. If we knew anything coming in, we've confirmed going out that data and partnerships are key. And therefore, what we believe is going to be the process going forward is maintaining this community that we have created informally, recruiting additional players to the table, and facilitating that dialogue that we all keep saying is so necessary. It seems that with the the informal conversation that we started in what might have been 8 or 10 different panels, really brought us to the notion that we need to be able to understand everyone's challenges. We need to be able to prioritize the group challenges. We need to be able to agree to what are the priorities that we should collectively address. We likely need to be able to develop parallel paths for each of our organizations so that we are moving in alignment and in harmony. And then we need to agree to what are those efforts that we can bring together and move on together. There are several of those that come to mind that are related to policy that cross all of our organizations and or domains. It comes to the training that is absolutely necessary. Training and awareness and education that even will be necessary not only of our own practitioners, but necessary from the policy influencers, writers, developers, and actors at the federal, state, and local levels. It's necessary from the system perspective and the data perspective. And interestingly enough, not surprisingly, we know that the technical solutions, though they are challenging, and even with our last two topics on this panel, they are yet to be realized because we still try to access data in ways that won't rock our boat and reutilize the investments of decades that are in our practitioner organizations. We do have work to do there, but the technology can be easy. And I say that relatively. I do not mean to say that technology is not critical. Technology can be, and we know it to be, a solve on many different levels. But that education that preceded the technology reference and the cultural shift that then follows it, I think has been one of the critical messages that came out of these 2 days, and actually these 3 days, because for those of you that have been able to be with us these 3 days, you'll recall that we started off with an emergency communications response summit. From soup to nuts, from call receipt all the way through to how do we redefine the data that we need to collect and share. This all speaks to the vast spectrum that is the justice domain. I couldn't agree more with Domingo's references to justice as opposed to criminal justice, as opposed to police reform, et cetera. There are so many different themes and threads that came out of this that collectively, I believe that we can go several steps further with what is starting at the initiation of the challenges through to what are the partnerships that we should codify and move together in unison with. The cultural shift, the cultural education may be the greatest challenge that we have. I select that word deliberately, not to be the greatest problem that we have or the greatest barrier, though I understand it to be the one that will consume more of our time. But I have faith that if we come together, we will be able to realize success in those areas. We know it's not going to be universal. We know it's not going to be quick. We know that it's not going to be something that's going to be instantaneous. I couldn't agree more with some of the passion that Domingo demonstrated and his messages that were reiterated before, during, and after his discussion. We do need leadership. We do need clear vision. We do need financial support. We do need policies that codify all these things. But we also know that none of that's going to happen in a clear line and a logical thought pattern. Therefore, I thank all of the panelists, all of the supporters of the IJIS community that include all of those different organizations that we spoke about. And I look forward to engaging everyone in the future in order to address these challenges. Maybe not solve these challenges, but address these challenges. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't thank our board of directors, our staff who was able to pull this off. And I say that because we look forward, we so look forward to what are the live events where we can be doing this in person and where we could have several different sessions running simultaneously and where we could have a true active dialogue with our participants and in our engagements. And we're not in this somewhat sterile environment of these virtual settings. It met the mark. It suited our purpose during the pandemic. We will certainly continue to utilize these benefits and these assets for smaller sessions and for summits and for forums of certain kinds. but we do look forward to our mid-year briefing and our symposium and other meetings being in person. To that end, I thank our staff, as I said, and I thank all of you for supporting our mission, for supporting justice reform, and for thanking you in advance that we, in fact, will collectively work towards meeting these challenges. Thank you all, and look forward to hearing all of your comments, suggestions for improvements, and any edits that you may have to our events in the future. I will lastly remind you that if you fill out our evaluation form, you will be automatically enrolled in what could be an award or winning of a Amazon Fire HD Kindle. It's an incentive to get the evaluation in, and very honestly, the more important part is that we get your input into this process. We are nothing if we are not our partnerships and our value to you. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in person. Bye-bye now.